Ready to go.
Okay, all right. Welcome to our ongoing series with Dr. Fred Provenza. My name is Michael Thiele, Grazing Club Coordinator for the Manitoba Grazing Clubs. Funding for the Grazing Club initiative comes from Ducks Unlimited Canada. So this winter, we've recorded a number of webinars. Please check them out on YouTube at the Manitoba Grazing Club's channel. So welcome back, Fred, to our fourth webinar. Glad to have you back. And, this has become kind of a weekly event. We were talking about that we both seem to look forward to. So that's great. And we've had some wonderful conversations on a whole broad range of topics. And mainly applicable to agriculture. And so that's been great. And, today we're going to continue with our discussion on let food be our medicine, and then moving into a discussion on the importance of society and culture, be it a cow or a human. And I'll let Fred explain what that means, and we'll get started. So thanks, Fred.
Yes, Michael, thank you too. And I have very much been enjoying our conversations, both prior to when we go on the air, so to speak, and once we get on the air as well. So we said we'll try to link this whole menagerie of things under this broad title of how palates link animals with landscapes, including humans. And we started out talking about change being the only constant and why that's so important to think in an evolutionary sense of dynamism and systems constantly changing, and we needing to change as well, ecologically, socially, economically, as systems change. So we used that to set the stage. Then we went on to talk about let feed be thy medicine, which really focused a lot on livestock and the importance of plant diversity. This idea that plants turn dirt into soil, and diverse mixtures of plants turn soil into homes, grocery stores, and pharmacies for all life, below ground and above ground as well. We then moved away from that topic onto this topic we're on now, this notion of let food be our medicine. And we were emphasizing last time, I think, in a broad sense, the linkages. If we think, people talk a lot about soil nowadays and the importance of soil, and obviously soil is critical. We stepped back and talked a bit from an ecological standpoint about how resource availability, sunlight, moisture, and nutrients, and geologic history, in a sense, really influence what soils are available, so to speak, or what soils exist across landscapes. And, you have different kinds of low resource availability versus high. You have different development of soil, obviously. And we talked about then the links of how plant diversity and chemistry and soil and resource availability are all linked one with another. We went on then to say that plant diversity and chemistry influence the biochemical richness of the diets of livestock. And we went out of our way to make the point that the health of livestock, not just nutrition, but also pharmacy kind of medicinal health. When you have a rich array of plants, livestock are healthy. That's how wildlife maintain their health, and that's how, given the opportunity, domestic animals can as well. And we talked about that can be so valuable from a fossil fuel standpoint, because we end up putting a lot of resource that's fossil fuel intensive into trying to care for systems, including the animals, in ways that plants and plant diversity and chemistry once did, actually. And then we went on to make the point that the biochemical richness of the diets of animals not only affects their health, it affects the quality of milk, cheese, and meat for human consumption, which then influences our health at a cellular and organ system level. Then we talked about, in the food be thy medicine part, how our food habits have been hijacked in a sense. And we talked about Mark Shaxter's book, The Dorito Effect, And he points out that the flavor of meat and produce have become blander. At the same time, processed food has become irresistible. And so in that sense, we've disincentivized real foods because they don't taste good, and we've made junk food all the more desirable. And so we were talking about ways to try to make meat and produce become richer in terms of its flavor, and to try to incentivize those kind of things. We ended up, at this point, we said we've extracted the compound from the food from the diet from the culture, and we have little notion of how meal patterns or food combinations influence nutrition and health. And the emphasis that we were making there is on the culture and the importance of culture, not just for livestock, but for human beings as well. And so that brings us then this, when we started out, we're talking about there's 3 legs to this stool of nutritional wisdom. And we said, first off, the availability of foods in the environment. We talked about plant diversity from the standpoint of wild and domestic animals. And we said that when there's diverse arrays of plants, that becomes nutrition centers and pharmacies for creatures below and above ground. The same thing's true for we humans. The availability of wholesome foods becomes very important for us, as we'll talk about in this section that's coming up. We said, so that was one leg to the stool. Without that, you're not going to have nutritional wisdom. We said that our liking for the flavor for food is more than a matter of taste. We said that there are these flavor feedback relationships, and that this feedback is coming from these primary and secondary compounds in foods, and that that feedback is coming from cells and organ systems, including the microbiome inside the body. And so that's a really fundamental part of nutritional wisdom. Our liking for the food, if they're wholesome foods, same for wild and domestic animals, is a function of our physiological needs. And those needs are being expressed to us by a feedback from cells and organ systems. So that was a second leg to the stool that we talked quite a lot about. The leg we haven't talked about up to this point is the social cultural links. And so that's where we want to go today, talking first from a livestock standpoint, then from a human standpoint. And then we want to talk about the implications of all of that for livestock production and for selecting for locally adapted animals, having the animals work for us rather than us work for the animals. So I'll start off by saying that people have studied this in a wide range of different creatures, from insects, fishes, birds, mammals, earthworms. And it's clear that natal experiences influence food and habitat selection in this broad range of different taxa. It might surprise you to know that earthworms form preferences for soil where they're born and raised, just like that mountain bluebird there. When my wife Sue and I were living in the backwoods of Colorado, these little mountain bluebirds would show up in March of the year, getting prepared to have their families, to raise their families for the year. And then in the fall of the year, in October, they'd fly down south, neotropical migrants, and they'd winter down where it's nice weather. What we came to appreciate by our work with ornithologists and stuff is if you put a band on those little birds, what you come to realize is that the same birds come back to the same places year after year after year, and their family members come back to those same places. And what one comes to realize is it becomes the home field advantage for these birds, knowing a place, knowing what not to eat, where not to go to forage, knowing that if a flicker in the environment makes a particular sound, that's information for you. All those kind of things are learned, and they become what it means to be locally adapted. The home field advantage, we talk about it often in sports, it's the home field advantage in life. And so, probably 40 years ago now, When, when I was on the ranch 50 years ago, let's go back there, you're working, as all of you know, you're working on our ranch. We had goats, we had sheep, we had cows, and you're working with young animals a lot. And sometimes you're raising orphan lambs and you realize how much they bond to you actually. And you see these experiences are influencing them. So when I got to the university and was doing studies with goats and watching again mothers and offspring, my interest was so piqued. So as a faculty member, this is something I want to study. And so we did. We looked at the role of mother, and we found that mother's influence begins in the womb, when when her offspring are not even born. During the last trimester of gestation, the fetal taste system is fully functional in animals. And so the foods that mother is eating are starting to, the flavors of those foods are getting into the amniotic fluid. The young fetus is already starting to learn about the flavors of foods that mom's eating. After birth, those flavors get into mother's milk, and they're more cues for a young animal. They're preparing that animal. They're making the world around them familiar. That food world is becoming familiar through mother. Mother then really does the job, completes that job when the young offspring start to follow her around. And they learn very, very quickly what mom's eating, what she's not eating, and so forth. So mother becomes a model. So it wasn't surprising that it was very easy to show these kind of influences, though I will say at the time, at least within academic circles, there was not much appreciation of that. I think people who have worked with animals understand that, maybe not quite so much in terms of the food selection part, but certainly people understand that has a role, people in agriculture. What we came to realize over time too, and I'm going to show you a short video segment on this, is that so mother's knowledge of the environment, in a way, we could think of that as adding stability. Her knowledge helps to ground animals in an environment, her knowledge of that total environment. But offspring, on the other hand, and anyone who's been around a young animal knows this, they're constantly exploring. They're exploring everything. And offspring in that sense, and I'm going to show you this, they can bring new information into the group. And so mother can actually end up learning from offspring. It can become a two-way street, basically. And I'll give you an example here right now. Many years ago, I could give you many examples from all kinds of different creatures, but we'll do this one here to try to make the point. Many years ago, we were devising ways to train animals to avoid eating particular plants, and it involved feedback, and we devised some training techniques where we'd offer the food to an animal, and I'm going to show you a video that illustrates that. And after they eat the food, we would give them a mild dose of a compound called lithium chloride. Now, lithium is historically was used as a table salt for human beings. It's now used to treat manic depression in humans, but in low doses, it's harmless. It's like everything. The dose makes the toxin. And if we gave a little bit of an excessive dose, what we found is that animals would very strongly avoid the food that they'd just eaten. So we developed a protocol. We'd offer the food we wanted to train them to avoid first thing in the morning. Immediately after they ate that, we'd use a bowling gun to put a capsule of this lithium chloride down into their gut. And next day, they didn't want to eat the food, basically, long story short. So people were learning about that work. And there are some people up in Washington State that wanted us to work with them on a project. And it's the background of the project that's of most interest in this case. So they were foresters, and they had convinced a sheep producer to graze in their forest plantations. They had these young Douglas fir seedlings that they were trying to get established. And their idea, and rightfully so, was that if we can get this flock of 1,000 sheep to eat the understory around these plants, that's going to reduce competition for moisture, nutrients, perhaps even sunlight. and it's going to encourage these plants to grow. And so it was a good idea, and it actually worked. So the first year they brought this flock of 1,000 sheep in there, ewes and lambs, and everything went as planned. Couldn't have gone better. So the next year they brought them back again. But during that second year, these Douglas firs started to produce new growth. Those candles there, that light colored material, that light colored needles that's in the slide there, and the lambs started to eat that new growth off of those off of the trees. Well, by the end of the year, not only were the lambs eating them, but the ewes were eating them as well. So the third year, they brought the flock back, and now from the get-go, the ewes with a new flock of lamb, but now the ewes are eating that new growth, and the lambs are learning from the ewes. So we see it go full cycle to where the lambs initially trained the ewes, learned the behavior, who then trained the lambs. So let me show you a video that captures all of this. And what we did in this particular video was we had trained the ewes to eat one food and not another food. And then we just simply showed how the lambs learn by watching and going with mother.
Instead of their normal morning meal, these ewes and their lambs are being offered a meal of Russian olive and carrageenan. Ewes are familiar with both shrubs, but after eating carrageenan, they received a bolus of lithium chloride. This caused nausea and an aversion to carrageenan. The lambs have no experience with either plant, so they choose to eat what mom eats. After eating the shrubs with their mothers each morning for 5 days, the lambs are put into the pen without their mothers. Because they have experience from eating with mom and from positive feedback from the nutrients in Russian olive, they stick to what mom ate and avoid what she avoided. This second set of ewes are averted to Russian olive but eat carrageenan. After exposure to the shrubs, the lambs are sent in to graze without their mothers. Again, they choose to eat what mom ate. For the final morning of the demonstration, both groups of lambs enter the pen to a choice of Russian olive and carrageenan. Our theory is that the lambs whose mothers ate Russian olive will continue to eat Russian olive, and those whose mothers ate carrageenan will eat carrageenan. We've placed C's on the backs of the lambs who should eat carrageenan to help you track their progress. Lambs not marked with C's should eat Russian olive. In just a short time, the lambs separate into the groups representing the foods that their mothers ate. In the process, they try the other food. This is only one of a number of studies showing that an animal's mother is the single most important factor in determining what foods it eats and where it lives. It also demonstrates how young animals try new foods based on what they see their herd mates eating.
So, but basically that video captures all that I was trying to say up to that point. I've got, Michael, a few examples here then, and there are many. We did so many studies with goats, sheep, and cattle of these transgenerational linkages, but I've included just a couple here to try to make the point of the power of experience early in life to influence behavior throughout the lifetime of animals. And our interest was in working with livestock producers back in the day, and I'm probably mentioned, pretty certain I did, that we were interested in the economics of ranching and how do you cut costs? How do you help people to be profitable? And we knew that in the Western US where we were, feeding during winter was huge a place where that was the main cost of ranching because it involved irrigating, cutting, baling, hauling hay, all the machinery involved in that during the spring and summer and fall of the year, and then feeding hay during the winter. Hugely expensive. So the idea was, how do you cut costs? And one of the ways we were doing that was two ways. I'm going to first talk about feeding straw as a low-cost alternative, but later in the presentation, I'm going to talk about winter grazing, which is really was the least cost of all. But what we did in this particular study was that we had calves that were exposed to straw early in life for a couple of months with mother, and then other calves that had never seen straw. Now, what's the amazing thing about this study and why I'm including it is then these calves didn't see straw again for 5 years. So the, exposure early in life, but then don't even see it again for 5 years. And then we ran a 3-year study where straw was the bulk of the diet from December through May. And what we found was that throughout all 3 years of that study, the calves that had eaten straw with their mothers early in life maintained higher body weight and condition. They produced more milk, and they had shorter postpartum intervals when they were fed straw as the bulk of their diet during pregnancies from 5 to 8 years of age. Now, I want to make a point here that I'm going to come back to. The first year, the differences were the largest, and they were very big. The next year, though, the differences weren't quite as big. That is to say, the naive cows had learned a little bit during that previous winter. By the third year, the differences were even less. They were still statistically significant. That is to say, that there were differences between the two groups, but they got less and less over the 3 years. But who would think that a little bit of exposure early in life would have that kind of profound of an influence on the ability of cows to utilize straw? Now, we went on after that to look at in utero experiences. And in this case here, pregnant cows were fed straw while they were gestating. And then we looked at the calves' response after birth. And we found that calves exposed to straw in utero ate more straw, they digested straw better, and they grew faster than calves not exposed to straw. So here's two studies that are showing the profound influence of experience early in life to enable animals to eat a poor quality forage. I'm going to come back to this when we talk about winter grazing and we think about winter ranges like this one in the slide on top there. And think about if you have a calf that's been exposed to that and then she becomes a member of your herd, she has great advantages in terms of her ability to utilize food that another animal might not. Another example here from another continent. Here's some work that our friends in Australia did. And now they're working with ewes and lambs. And they found that lambs exposed to salt brush in utero grow faster. They handle the salt load better than lambs from mothers who've been raised on pastures that lack salt brush. When they looked at what's happening inside the animals, kidney function, for example, they found they excrete salt more rapidly. They drink less water and they maintain higher intake when eating salt brush. So that is to say that not only is their behavior changed, but their form and function, their anatomy and physiology has changed as well to better accommodate use of salt brush. I want to make one other point here related to this. Many years ago, and I think I may have talked about this already, the old memories, I'm not certain, but many years ago at the U.S. Sheep Experiment Station in DuBois, Idaho, they were selecting for sheep that ate a large amount of sagebrush, which is very common throughout the Great Basin, and it's oftentimes viewed as a as a species that increases in abundance, mainly because of spring grazing by livestock. And people don't like it much. They try to get rid of it. Well, we're thinking about, and they were thinking about, how do we turn it into a forage resource? More about that later on in the presentation. But what they did was to look at fecal samples from the 5,000 sheep that were there at the station, and they identified a subgroup that really ate a lot of sagebrush. And they and we were thinking it was a physiological adaptation that enabled those sheep to do that. And it very well could have been. We know that that happens. But in this case, as they went on to study those sheep and their behavior, what they found was that these sheep were utilizing bitterbrush, which is high in tannins, as an appetizer to help the sagebrush go down. Bitterbrush, the tannins in bitterbrush bind terpenes in sagebrush, and so they're not absorbed into the body, and they're not having a harmful effect on limiting intake of sagebrush. So bitterbrush as an appetizer helps animals to eat more sagebrush. So this is another example of a learned pattern of behavior that would become a part of the culture of a group if passed from mother to offspring. So let me conclude here with a couple of thoughts. I alluded to this already, this idea that not only has behavior changed, but form and function has changed. So what we'll say here then is environments influence gene expression, which influences form, function, and behavior. I talked about kidney function. We did studies that looked at how rumen volume and function was changed. Others have done studies to look at how the central nervous system has changed. You can basically come to understand that all the organ systems of the body are changing as a function of experience. That was illustrated so nicely for humans in this book, A Change of Heart by Claire Sylvia. And this book was about, she was one of the first people ever to receive heart and lung transplant. And so the book is about her experience and what she learned. You know, you think, and doctors think the heart is just a machine, the lungs are just machines, they're organs. But what she made come alive in this book is they're not. The person you get those organs from becomes a part of you, basically. And so she went on a journey to find out. She was so different after she got this transplant. She went on a journey to find out where her heart and lung came from. Turns out it came from a 20-year-old male who'd been killed Tim was his name, had been killed in a motorcycle accident. Well, her first experience that something was different occurred to her in the hospital. And she was on an exercise bike, and because she was one of the first people to ever have this done, the press was there. They were really interested. And at the end of the interview, one of the people asked her, if you could have anything you want right now to eat or drink, what would you want? She said, actually, I'd like a beer. And she said she wished she could take those words back the minute they came out of her mouth for two reasons. One, she said it was a really flippant response to a sincere question. And she said, two, I don't even like beer. So that was her first inkling that something major had changed. Well, what she came to find out was her taste preferences broadened to include food she never liked before that Tim liked very much. And she gives many, many examples of those, from green peppers to chicken McNuggets to on and on and on. But when we say feedback is being mediated by cells and organ systems as a function of their needs, you can also say their preferences as well. That was that heart and lungs that were changing her liking for the flavor of food. So it's simply to say that the environment where a person's born and reared influences gene expression, which influences form, function, and behavior in all creatures, including us. You know, there's some great books and videos on this topic, origins, how the 9 months before birth shaped the rest of our lives from the human standpoint. I think the best movie I've ever seen on epigenetics is this Nova special titled Ghost in Your Genes. It's an old video by now. I don't know, maybe going on 10, 15 years ago, this came out, but it's as relevant now as it ever was, and I still delight in watching that video. If you don't understand what epigenetics is, if you'd like to learn more about it, that's a fabulous video on how these experiences in utero and early in life and during our life can influence gene expression, which influences form, function, and behavior. Some of the examples, I'll give you two that they talk about in this video. One was some work that Randy Jirtle was doing, and he had obese and thin mice that differed in coat color, light and dark brown. And you know, they were inbred mice, and this would go from one generation to the next. But what he found, the amazing thing he found, was that if he supplemented these obese females with a compound called genistein, their offspring were born normal. They weren't obese. They didn't have any of the issues that typically occur that we're going to talk about here in a minute, related to obesity and diet-related diseases. So here was an example of how diet was changing through epigenetics, form and function of offspring, and it was a game changer, a huge study with important implications. They also talked about in the video some work that was done by Canadian researchers, and what they were doing was looking at the importance of nurturing early in life, and they found that mothers who nurtured their offspring, mother rats who licked a great deal, that caused gene expression for genes for calmness. Their pups were very calm, and they weren't, as a result of the lack of constant stress in their life, they did not express diseases that these unlicked rat pups did. So nurturing early in life increases calmness and reduces stress-related diseases in adults. You might think from your own upbringing, how were you licked or not licked by your parents, basically, with regard to that. So to sum up then, simply saying that these experiences early in life influence all creatures. There's a proud otter mother, with her offspring. Cetaceans, marvelous kind of work's been done on transgenerational linkages of cetaceans as they're crossing huge distances in the seas, and what they're learning and how that's transmitted. Polar bears in the Arctic, tigers in India, Africa, African lions. Incredible work's been done with elephants. I'll talk just a bit more about that, but their matrilines and the influence of mother on offspring and family groups and so forth. Same sort of thing with giraffes. Of course, the primates have been studied a lot over the years. And then we have raccoons in your house, or in this case here, somewhere near Walmart. And that brings me to the last topic that I'll mention. Then let's take a little bit of a break, Michael, and then we can talk. And that's, you know, this part here. And when I do it in person, people laugh a lot about that. But it's we are influenced very strongly by these experiences in utero and early in life. And there's been a good deal of work on humans to show these kind of effects that I've been talking about. Flavors in a mother's amniotic fluid, experiences early in life with milk and with solid foods, well documented in human beings as a part of the culture. Perhaps the most interesting studies that in a very real way link what it means to have a culture that's creating healthy individuals, and that being linked with the nutritional wisdom of the body and the availability of alternatives, was done nearly a century ago by a lady named Clara Davis. in terms of availability of alternatives, that first leg of the stool, she was offering, what happened was that she was working in orphanages, and she was working with 15 children that had been given up for adoption, given up basically at birth for adoption. And she worked with them over a 6-year period. It's amazing to think, actually, that they did this. And what they did throughout the year, these were the 34 foods that were offered in season and so forth to these young children. Here's from this top things. Here's from notes and photo from her study. So the availability of alternatives, giving them wholesome alternatives was the first key part of this. Second part was she told the nurses, you're not to give these children any indication of what foods you think they should select. You simply offer those foods to each child individually and allow that child to eat what it wants. And she made several observations that were really, really interesting. One is that there was no indication that the kids innately knew what or what not to eat. They sampled everything at first, including the silverware and the napkins and so forth. But each child over a period of days and weeks would come to have preferences. And I would argue those preferences were what suited its body best. She also made the point that when kids, for instance, came in with rickets, they would select and strongly prefer cod liver oil, even though for most of us that don't have that deficiency, we would not want to eat cod liver oil. They very strongly preferred that. So she makes the point they were selecting foods that met the needs of their body. She also made the point that no two children ever selected the same diet and no child ever selected the same food from day to day. Now, I want to digress just briefly to make a point. We did studies with cattle where we were finishing them 2 months in, quote, the feedlot. And we had half of the cattle were getting a total mixed ration. The other half of the cattle were given the ingredients that went into that ration free choice. And we were talking about how it cost less in the end, actually, to feed the group that was given free choice. But the point I want to make here ties directly in with Clara's work. We found that when they were given a choice, no two cows ever selected the same diet. No cow ever selected the same foods from day to day. But like Clara's kids, they selected foods that met their needs. And they ended up eating less food and eating less of the more costly food. So Clara had pediatricians following those kids, studying them, and they wrote papers about it. And they concluded that they had never seen a healthier bunch of children. So Clara concluded her work by saying the results leave the selection of food to be made available to children in the hands of their elders, where everyone has always known it belongs. In this case here, Clara was the culture. She was the elder. She was the mother. So that's the third leg of the stool. Availability of alternatives, flavor feedback relationships, mother as a model, in this case, at least providing appropriate foods for her offspring. But the problem is that since Clara's time, the diets haven't been left in the hands of the elders. The choices we learn to make are strongly influenced by corporate, political, and academic elders. And so much has been written about this topic and the huge influence. And we'll talk more next time about books like The Big Fat Surprise and how our dietary habits, in essence, have become hijacked. But for right now, we'll just leave it to say that it's been these corporate, political, and academic elders. And so you have the food industry, the medical industry, universities, and pharmacy industry that have really reinforced one another in terms of poor diets and health. I was reading a chapter from a book, the forthcoming book here recently titled Follow the Money. And she so makes the point about this kind of incestuous relationship amongst amongst these different industries. And again, this is sounding really critical and like I'm blaming, I'm not, but it's important to realize that there's a lot of money to be made off of people not being healthy. And ultra-processed foods really have created a pandemic of obesity and diet-related diseases whose symptoms, the medical pharmaceutical industries treat at enormous kind of expense. And so now here in the US, over 75% of the people are overweight or obese, 50% pre-diabetic or diabetic, 88% metabolically unhealthy, 80% aren't even fit to serve in the military. So it's a crisis, and trying to get back to a culture that appreciates wholesome foods, as we've been talking about in the last presentation, to get back to wholesome foods and cultures that appreciate that, and genes that are being expressed to utilize those foods is really critical. And to move away from where we are now, the transgenerational effects now are transgenerational metabolic syndrome. And we know, again, many good studies, mothers who gain excessive weight during pregnancy, mothers who are obese, mothers who become diabetic during pregnancy are far more likely to have fatter babies with higher incidence of diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and cancer. And then you can go into different organ systems. Pancreas develops more insulin secreting cells, and so forth and so on. It's simply making the same points we were making earlier, but making them for humans. So I'll sum up this part by saying, therefore, after a 40-year case study, it's my contention that couch potatoes actually begin to develop early in life in tater tots. That's it. And then one can think about, and it's where we'll want to go next, what price do we pay when we ignore transgenerational linkages to social and biophysical environments? And with that, Michael, I'll be quiet for a minute and let you weigh in on thoughts that you
Sure.
have relative to what we've covered so far.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I was just going to start by saying, but I love tater tots, it's like, but yeah, we need to be oriented towards whole foods much more than processed foods. Yeah, there's a lot to say here. These are powerful and important ideas, not only for ourselves, but for those that are managing livestock, of course, right? You kind of bringing it all together. And I liked what you said about, so I've just made a few notes here. I like this home field advantage idea. That's sort of a powerful way to try to understand that there's a home field advantage in life by understanding, where you are, locally adapted to that. And I think even think about how people operate. We do tend to stay where we were born, or or within a range of that we can take advantage. It's almost like your unfair advantage, simply by you have a deeper understanding of that place than others that may come there, right? That, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely makes sense, and it brings up so many images for me. I know I was born and raised in the mountains of Colorado, and my heart will never leave there. It's just an attachment, I think, that people have for the place where they're born and reared. And then, as you're saying, all the plants, the animals, you learn all those things. It becomes familiar. It becomes home to you. So yes, your words are really making me feel that deep sense of attachment to place.
Yeah, and to the weather and all of it, right? You just you
at the deepest level. When we were in Australia during the Christmas season, there in that part of the world, it's warm and sunny, and for them, Christmas means beaches and suntan lotion and so forth. At the deep level, for us, it's like, boy, this isn't Christmas. The whole context is out of context because there's not snow and cold and short days. We get so linked, and animals do too. Animals do the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And then what else did I write down here? Oh, this was new information to me, that in the last trimester, the animal in utero, that animals' flavor systems fully developed. Is that sort of the correct way to say it?
Yes, the fetal taste system is fully developed by the last trimester. Some fabulous work was being done back in the days when we were doing our work in utero that was showing how, yeah, just showing that they're a fully functioning little creature, and what mom's eating is in, they're experiencing the flavors of that, and so you do experiments where you put flavors into the amniotic fluid deliberately, garlic or strawberry or whatever you want, put those flavors in there, and then when the young creature comes out and you're given a choice between strawberry and something it's never had, it goes for the strawberry because it experienced it in utero. Those kind of studies were being done.
So you start to understand how it all kind of builds from the mother to the family to the culture, the larger culture, right? And that it shapes our preferences for foods and spices and all that, right? That lots of people that I know are not very adventurous with their food choices just because they've come to like what they like, and they don't want to try something new from another culture. I find that strange, but that people have preferences. And
no, that's true. And we studied those kind of things too. We studied, if you raise an animal on a fairly restricted diet, but it'll work for that animal, versus animal that you're constantly offering new things. You can create adventurous versus not so adventurous eaters as a result of the way that you're
right. Okay, sure. That helps me to, So you can kind of start to understand how, why wouldn't that be the same way with animals? All we have to do is, have a simple examination of ourselves to understand that, right? And
it's so true. And I'll be honest with you, as we, over the 40 years I was working in this, devised studies, we were always using ourselves as a way to think about it. Well, what would we do? How might we respond? What might we do? Well, that might be an interesting study to do with sheep or with cows or with goats. So, we're simply, we're creatures too. We're all creatures on this planet. And and so we use that over and over again as our way to design, to think about what might be interesting studies to do.
Right. It makes me think, this power of adaptability, and that, if you think about it, us versus other animals, we have this like super ability to be adaptable. It may be like our superpower, as why we become so dominant on Earth, is that we think about the different ways that we live our life. We meaning the 7 or 8 billion people on the planet, and we somehow manage to adapt to that, whether through just sort of changes in evolution over time, or epigenetic effects, or just behavior and culture. And it makes me think, it's the gene versus the meme, right? It's the gene is the genetic stuff, the meme is the cultural stuff, right? The stories we tell ourselves that become super important as well.
Absolutely the case. And you think of all the environments that humans inhabit on this planet, it is stunning to think about that, and to think, as you're saying, the gene and the meme, and to think that they're totally related to one another, huh? Gene expression is being influenced by the social and biophysical environment, which is feeding back on the gene. And so you have a not one or the other, it's the relationship, the ongoing interrelationship amongst those things that's really mattering, and enabling animals to really evolve within the environments from generation to generation to generation as environments change, as we talked about way up front at the beginning of this series.
Right. And then finally, that Clara Davis study, I've heard you present that a few times, and that's just really important work that most people have no experience with. They're just not aware of it. And I kind of think about it, little kids and how it's difficult, food's always a challenge. And my simple understanding that was, was sort of all about power, right? Just the these little organisms wanting to express their ability to control their environment, right? And then food was a way to do that. But that's probably a overly simplistic understanding that a lot of it is sort of coming from a cellular level back up to the, cognitive and expressing itself in the child's, food preference.
No, that's absolutely the case. And yes, well said. And it does get you thinking about, certainly, you want kids to learn to eat a variety of different foods and to eat what's on your plate. And then it becomes a little bit of a balancing act too. I can't tell you how many people have told me after they heard me talk about Clara and stuff, and this is ladies a lot,
yeah,
that the way they feed their children, it's changed. They would offer them more choices and allow the child to select based on this idea that there is a wisdom in their body. It's not this little terror. And we have, Sue and I have children, so I say quote terror in quotes. It's not this thing trying to terrorize you. It's that its body is telling it. It's not really in control of the shop, right? It's
yeah,
the cells and organ systems. But that's where one has to be so careful about the ultra processed foods, because they're designed to, like we showed back in the last and the one with the feedback, they're designed to really hijack the system. And so Clara actually wanted to go on to study ultra processed foods. They were just starting onto the radar screen, but the depression hit. And so she said that and some that she'd written, that she never did get to go on to do that. She would have foreshadowed what we know happened. We've done that experiment over the last ever since those days, but she would have certainly been able to have provided some powerful insights. And who knows, maybe she would have been able to counter some of what happened. She certainly had a big influence. I would have loved to have known Clara Davis. Actually, I learned of her through Mark Shaxter, and he was reading the work that I described very quickly on TMR versus choice. And he said, wow, that's so much like what Claire was doing and talking about. And said, have you ever read her stuff? I said, no. And so he sent me a link to some papers, and I started reading. It was like we had plagiarized her. We were using the same kind of words that she was using. And it just made me realize that we were being struck so much by the same kind of things. We'd never even knew of her. But when she was saying, and we were saying, no two individuals ever selected the same diet. No individual ever selected the same foods from day to day. It was like, wow, that's exactly what she was writing. It was really neat. It was really neat. That she's a kindred spirit, even though she's long gone, probably before we started our work.
Right. It makes you think that someone should write the book and be almost like the definitive book on diet, and just to dismiss all this silliness of the diet industry by, spelling it all out. Here it is. It's much more about, what's going on at a cellular level, and that, no one diet is going to be the diet for a group of people, right? Which has sort of been how the whole diet industry has worked, right?
Yes, absolutely the case. And I can't tell you how many people too recently, it seems, to have made a comment to me that, really that means that you all the work that we were doing and what I was writing about nourishment really is that it means that there's no need for diet. There's no need to even go down that path. The body knows if it's given decent alternatives. And yeah, that's right. That's exactly it.
And I guess one last point, and then we can move on, is that, I think the key for the Clara Davis study is the fact that she gave high quality choices, right? There was no preference. There was no choice for stuff that was like processed food, or all the choices were whole foods, nourishing, high quality, however you want to say it, right? So you weren't able to hijack that flavor feedback mechanism and all. and all
That's
that.
absolutely the case. Absolutely the case. And Clara understood that too. You know, they were providing whole foods, wholesome foods, fresh as could be, including, you know, things that we would, including things that we would think may not be so palatable. Bone marrow, bone jelly, sweetbreads, brains, liver.
Yeah.
You know, good foods, and the children just accepted those foods. You know, they it was just, and so they had this, yeah, as you're saying, this range of really wholesome foods, and they were very, very healthy children
Yeah.
as a result. Okay, shall we move to some implications, Michael?
Yeah. Let's do it.
Let's talk. What I really want to emphasize is this idea of creating locally adapted herbivores. We alluded to some of this earlier in last presentation, but let's follow this through. And let's start by, and again, this isn't being the big critic, but just reflecting on the Green Revolution. During that period, farm, pasture, and range-based livestock production systems emphasized low diversity of high-producing plants, you know, the crops we were growing, huge monocultures of plants and animals. And what we did was to abandon locally adapted species of plants and animals in favors of new strains and breeds. You know, I think there was so much that was happening back in the day related to keeping your own seeds and to having locally adapted species of plants across landscapes. And now we've gone so much to GMO kind of technologies where all that's patented. I have to say, I think we're really shooting ourselves in the foot in doing that. And I'd also have to say too, many years ago, I was in Mexico. Oh, it must have been 35 years ago. I went down there to do a tour and give some talks, and they took me, the people that I was working with took me around to villages all around the place, and we were eating the local cuisine. And I'm telling you, they hadn't gotten on the GMO bandwagon yet, and the flavors of those foods, the flavors, you know, the flavors of the tortillas, for instance, they were out of this world. I have never before or never since had tortillas that had that richness of flavor, corn tortillas. And I know that was coming from the varieties of corn that they were growing down there, and then through to the herbs and spices and salsas that they had and the meats. It was fabulous, and it's made me realize more and more over the years how much we've lost when we've thrown all that out for one size fits all kind of approaches in plants. And then we did that same thing with animals as well. And as we talked last time, you know, we're able to really increase production in these systems, but the quality of the food went down, and it was at a price. It was totally based on fossil fuel inputs. As we talked last time, you know, to produce 1 calorie of food requires 2 calories of fossil fuels for machinery, fertilizer, and so forth. And then another 8 to 12 to process, package, deliver, store, and cook food. If you think of any wild species that's out there on its own, there's no way you make it expending 10 to 14 calories of energy to gain 1 calorie of energy. It isn't going to work, and it's not going to work for us into the future. We talked about Hagen's article, Economics for the Future Beyond the Superorganism, which you and I both read, Michael, and very much appreciated. It's a long article. There's an awful lot in that article. But if you're interested, it'll sure get you thinking a lot about how economics based simply on land, labor, and capital, which are very important, of course, but ignoring fossil fuel and what fossil fuel has enabled us to do, it's not going to work. And so, you know, here's the energy return on investment for fossil fuels at the finished fuel stage are much closer to those of renewable resources nowadays. Let's look up here. Domestic oil in 1930, it had 100-to-1 energy return on investment. That's huge. That's dirt cheap fossil fuel, basically. Let's go now to the 1970s. Imported and domestic oil are down to 40-to-1. Still hugely impressive, huh? Imported oils in 2005 down, say around 35 or so. Look at domestic oil now in the US. It's down here to about 10-to-1. So, you know, these renewable energies are becoming more and more favorable. Roughly 6-to-1, potentially as low as 3-to-1 for electricity. The increasing energy cost of extracting fossil fuels is going to cause the ratios to continue to decline, pushing energy resources toward a net energy cliff. We kick the can down the road with fracking, but that's still a very, very intensive practice when it comes to energy return on our investment. And so then to me, that makes me start to think more and more about how do you select for locally adapted plants, which we won't talk more about, but let's talk about locally adapted animals and landscapes. And I think back to a book I read many, many years ago titled The Last Ranch. It's about the San Luis Valley in Colorado. If you go from north to south across the state of Colorado, there are 4 big parks: North Park, Middle Park, South Park, and the San Luis Valley, which extends down into northern New Mexico. And in this book, Sam was talking about, it's a great book, actually. He was talking about many things, but one of the things he was talking about was local adaptation. And he was talking with an old fellow named George Whitten, who I fortunately got to meet many years ago. George is gone now, but wonderful fellow. And I was giving a talk, a keynote at a Kivera conference, and I didn't know the Whittens and didn't know old George. And I was talking about him. Unfortunately, I didn't offend any of the group. But the point I was making there was what George was saying. He was talking to his son, and he was saying, you know, back in 1935, we selected for ewes that produced 75-pound lambs, and we culled ewes with twins. So now in 1985, you're selecting for much larger ewes and lambs, 90-pound lambs, and you're selecting for 150-pound lamb crop. Then he said, our ewes were strong and well-muscled as deers. Yours wouldn't last a day where ours went. So why was he saying all that stuff? What he was saying is you've increased production, but you haven't increased profitability. We were more profitable than you were. You produced more, but we were more profitable. Then he goes on to say, there was some people that came through, and I love this story, and I'm not going to do it probably the justice that he did, but he said there were some people that were learning about the old sheep cycle. So what they used to do was they would start in the bottom of the San Luis Valley in the late winter, early spring, and they'd move like wildlife. They'd move up into the mountains, and they'd spend their summers in the mountains, traversing these vast areas there. And then in the fall, they'd move back down and they'd winter down in the San Luis Valley. That's why he's saying, our ewes were strong and well-muscled as deers. Yours wouldn't last a day where ours went. And so he said these people wanted to try, they saw the wisdom in it. And they wanted to try to create the old sheep cycle. And he makes the point. He said, quote, they were crazy. Once the knowledge is gone, you can't get it back just like that. They didn't even add a dog that knew anything. When they went through here, knew where they were looking for trouble, and they found it. Then he goes on to describe what a wreck that all turned out to be. Now, he wasn't saying you shouldn't try to recreate the old sheep cycle, but he was saying absolutely clearly that everything that we've been talking about the culture, about form, about function, about matching form and function to landscape, he knew that. He knew that from his experience. He didn't know about epigenetics or any of this kind of stuff we're talking about. and culture he would have known about, but he understood the relationship and the importance of that, of the knowledge, not only in the people and how to do that, but in the animals themselves. And so the point I'd like to make then, and move on from George and his story, is that old dogs can learn new tricks, but young dogs learn them quicker. Young animals just, they're little learning beings. That's what they do. They explore, they learn. We did so many studies showing that the older animal gets, the more they get set in their ways in terms of food and habitat selection patterns. And so the age of the animal and the challenge, how different is what you're asking an animal to do relative to what it's been doing, both the age, the older they get, challenge, the greater the challenge, both those influence how quickly animals are going to be able to learn about something new. So we worked with so many livestock producers over the years, especially in the last 10 years that I was at Utah State University. And we were always, all of us, talking about learning curves, and that, okay, so you decide that you want to become more profitable. You don't want to feed hay all winter long anymore, because you know that's going to be better in so many ways, economically, ecologically, socially, maybe for you as well. So you're over here and you want to get over here, but there's this adaptation trough, these learning curves, whatever you want to consider it. And you know, they affect people. We have to learn new patterns of behavior. That's a challenge. The animals have to do that. Even the plants, you might be surprised. There's going to be a change in terms of plants and plant behavior. And back in those days, I was reading about soils, and they were talking about it's a minimum of 3 to 5 years for soils to really make a change when you change farming practices, inorganic to organic, or when you change grazing practices and stuff. In other words, there's this adaptation trough and learning curve. And the first year is the worst. The next year, things get a little better. The next thing, even better. And then once you get out there 3 to 5 years or so, you're cruising along again. But this was up front and central because we knew, you know, if people are going to change, if they think it's worthwhile to change, that have to be ready to deal with this trough and try to, our goal was to try to think about how to make this trough not so deep, not so tough, economically, ecologically, socially. So, so we worked with people then, and I have wonderful videos, but with people like Ray Bannister out in eastern Montana. You know, Ray changed the food and habitat selection patterns, the food selection patterns of his cattle herd out there. He was having invasive species like leafy spurge and sagebrush abundance increasing, and snowberry plants that he appreciated, but he didn't want them to be the dominant plants in the community. He wanted them to be members of the community, not the only thing there. And we worked with Ray, and Ray worked through his grazing management practices to train his animals to, rather than eat the best and leave the rest, to mix the best with the rest. We worked hard, and there are ways that you can learn to graze so that animals utilize everything that's up there. And we've talked some about that already, different ways to do that. We worked with people like Bob Budd, who was fourth generation rancher who was managing at that time Red Canyon Ranch for the Nature Conservancy. Bob's had a lifelong influence, not only in ranching, but in conservation and how you can blend those two. Bob did marvelous kind of work on Red Canyon Ranch, and with the grazing practices and also habitat selection. One of the things he did was to hire a rider. When he took over at Red Canyon, there were 250 cows, and they lived in those bottomlands. They were beating riparian areas to death. What he decided was to retrain that cattle herd. He hired a rider. Every day, that rider's job was to move those cattle out of those bottoms and up into the uplands. First year was a son of a gun. Second year was even better. And if animals absolutely refused to stay out of those bottoms as they worked over those first 2 years, they culled them. By the third year, they were cruising. And the person who he'd hired for the rider had actually worked himself out of a job, because by the third year and beyond, who's training the calves where to live? You've changed the culture of the herd. And now the cows appreciate the upland. They come to the lowland to get a drink, but they don't stay there. They live up there in the upland. So, you know, it's possible to change food and habitat selection behaviors, even of old animals, through the ways that you manage grazing, through the ways that you manage habitat selection. Going back to green revolution kind of stuff, fossil fuels enabled people to select for animals that lack the ability to thrive on foods and habitats available to them year round. Much of the cost of ranching, as we've been saying, is due to feeding hay in the winter. And so we worked a lot on that with different people. I want to give one example here. I've mentioned sagebrush in the Great Basin, and most ranchers, I think, don't have a very high opinion of sagebrush. But we were doing studies first with sheep and then with cattle to think about, is there a learned component to ability to utilize sagebrush? Is there a nutritional component that, for instance, can supplements help them to utilize sagebrush? And we were showing that animals can learn in utero and early in life to better utilize sagebrush, but also that supplements can help them to utilize sagebrush. Sagebrush is very high in terpenes that have to be detoxified. If animals either have plants like bitterbrush that we talked about available to them that can counter the terpenes in sagebrush, or if they're provided with the supplement like supplemental hay during the winter, that can help them to utilize sagebrush. And so we did a lot of studies to show these kind of relationships, and also to show that like with wildlife species and their use of sagebrush, sagebrush is most palatable during the late fall and the winter of the year, because terpene concentrations decline during that time of the year. They rise and are very high during the spring and the summer, which is why livestock don't want to utilize sagebrush, and they end up eating all the other grasses and forbs and simply increasing the abundance of sagebrush when we graze, spring graze on those landscapes. So the key point I'm trying to make here is that we were really working with people who came to realize that they could utilize sagebrush as a forage during the winter, that where they had really basically monocultures of sagebrush, they could provide some supplemental feed. So, okay, let's continue to feed hay for a little bit here, not as much as you used to feed, because part of the diet, 30% of it's going to be made up by sagebrush, which is very nutritious plant. And so we were able to work with people like Matt Carter from Crown Cattle Company, who, after he participated in a workshop where we were talking about the topics we'd been covering, he decided that he would start to winter graze sagebrush, that he would feed out there on sagebrush with the hay. And over a several year period, what he was able to do is turn sagebrush into a forage resource to greatly cut back the amount of hay that he needed to supplement. And if you think about it, he's accomplishing several objectives. One is he's reducing the winter feeding bills on his property. Two, he's utilizing something that he never thought of as a forage resource. Three, beyond that, he's rejuvenating his landscape without using herbicides to do that, or mechanical treatments or fire. He's using livestock to reduce the abundance of sagebrush and increase the abundance of grasses and forbs. And so sagebrush went from a costly nuisance to a forage resource. And it was several factors that we've been talking about that were involved in that conversion. So like their wild ancestors, domestic livestock can learn to be locally adapted to the environments that they inhabit. And we also did really neat videos about everywhere from the bayous of Louisiana, where they were talking about upland cattle that really don't know how to forage when they're brought into these bayou bottoms with all this water. And you know, when we were back there, we laughed because to us, an upland means like mountains and stuff. Oh, to them, it's simply a very small change in elevation, but it's cattle that don't know how to forage down in these bottomlands, in these wetlands. They get into big trouble when they're moved. And so this video that we have, these guys are telling the story about local adaptation and how important it is. I talked about cattle wintering on blackbrush dominated landscapes and doing very well. Those ranchers understood that they could select for a frame size, kind of thing Kit Farrow talks about all the time. They weren't these huge framed animals. They were smaller framed animals that learned to utilize that resource. And like I mentioned when I talked about it earlier, I've never seen cattle put their head down and just mow brush. They looked like goats. It was absolutely stunning. We also have video of dairies when people were starting to move. Good friend Daryl Emick, who did so much work in New York and really around this country on pasture-based dairying and getting people to move away from total confinement to pasture-based dairying and the benefits of pasture-based dairying. And now we could add, you know, if animals are on diverse mixtures of plants, we could think about milk and cheese that could be made from that would be totally different from that's simply coming from a total mixed ration. So all these and many more were examples of where we were working with livestock producers to try to create locally adapted animals. And why? Because it was more profitable. That was the idea. It was a way to increase profitability and at the same time increase ecological and social values. So what I've alluded to and what we can make more specific now is what's important then is to retain animals that can survive only on what nature provides seasonally in your landscapes. That's what many of the folks we were working with started to do, thinking about what resources do I have available. And if I try to get out of these fossil fuel loops of irrigating, cutting, baling, hauling hay, all that stuff, what do I have available and how could I utilize it as a year-round forage resource? And then how can I create animals that know how to utilize that resource? Matching production cycles to seasonal availability of forage. It's a point that Kit Farrow makes over and over again. Think about when are wildlife having their babies, and that's probably the low-cost time of year to be having livestock have their babies. So fall, winter becomes maintenance time. So you don't need so much really expensive feed. You know, calving in the winter is incredibly expensive. Lactation for mother, last trimester of gestation and lactation are hugely expensive in terms of nutrition and cost then to rancher. Spring, summer, have that as the time period for reproduction. Calve in spring, winter on forages, which ties back with what I was talking about on those mature forages and having animals that can utilize mature plants during the winter season and bodies that are able to utilize those very well. Rear offspring with their mothers where they will be expected to produce as adults, as we've been saying. And then there's this whole other idea, and I'm not suggesting here that people should be doing this, but there are some real advantages to be thought of. And I just want to raise this point related to creating families based on epigenetic and learned abilities of matrilineals to use diets and habitats. And this book here, The Buffalo Harvest, by Frank Meyer. Frank Meyer came out west after the Civil War, immediately after the Civil War. And as he writes in the book, this short little book that's really insightful in terms of what it was like out here in the West at that time of the year, in that time period. And he was making the point that he thought he could come out here and shoot bison and get rich. Well, that certainly wasn't the case. It was very, very hard work. And there's a part in the book where he talks about the work of it all, but he also talks about what they had to do to be successful as bison hunters and the routine that they were in. And he says in there, he starts out saying, do you remember buffalo herds, thousands strong, moving across landscapes, stopping trains and so forth? He says, isn't that about the idea that you have in your mind of what it looked like out here in the West? But he says, if that is the idea that you had in your mind, he said, get it out of your mind fast, because he says the fact is, and he went over a 5-state region. The fact is, he said, I never saw a buffalo herd that was over 200, and most of them were very much smaller, 15 to 20 animals or so. He said in these small groups, the bison traveled and fed. And he said certainly they would come together as one big group when a fright appeared, but then they'd separate into their small groups. And he said, do keep these groups in mind because they formed the basis for our attack. And then he goes on to talk about what was the basis of their attack. So how were they doing this? And he said, at the head of each of these little groups wasn't a big old buffalo bull ready and willing to whip the universe. It wasn't a bull at all. So at the head of each of these groups was the matriarch. She was the key animal in the group. And what they were then were these extended families with her offspring. And so her kids and grandkids and the nieces and nephews and the young males would go off into their bachelor groups as they got older and older. But it was the key to their success in hunting was to identify the matriarch, and then they would wound her. They'd wound the matriarch, not kill her, they'd wound her, and the other members of the family wouldn't leave. And so then they'd shoot each of the members of the family. Then the people who were working with them would come. They'd skin all the buffalo for the hides, and then he'd go off to find the family that he was going to shoot first thing in the morning on the next day. So the idea was then that, and I make this point, we often say that these animals just in Africa as well, they lived in these massive, massive herds, and certainly there are herds, but it misses this key point that these animals weren't just in massive herds. They were in these small family groups is the key point I'm trying to make. So bison lived in extended families. They decide when to move democratically and where to move despotically. So we did a bunch of studies just of the internal dynamics of these groups and how they decide where to go across landscapes and the role of the matriarch and all the older animals and so forth. Becomes very, very interesting study of the interrelationships among the members of the matriarch, also among the old bulls, the old mature bulls and so forth. There's just a huge, huge dynamic that nobody had ever been paying attention to. And that's probably still very little appreciated about that. I remember many, many years ago, I was in Africa, in South Africa, and we went to a game reserve called Addo. And I forget, I think they had something like 300 elephants at that reserve. And we went out very early in the morning with some of the wildlife biologists who knew of our studies and our interest. And they knew, they had named every one of those elephants in Addo Park. They knew every one of the families. So these elephants didn't exist in just one massive herd. They existed in families, like you see there in the slide in the upper left. And I remember distinctly being there at a watering hole and those elephants coming in, and they said, oh, there's, I forget the name, but I will say there's Lucy, she's the matriarch of that group, and there's Matilda, who's one of her old offsprings, and there's Nancy, she's the youngest member of the group, and so forth. They had just fundamentally amazing knowledge of these elephants in the environment, and that led to really important kind of implications. When they wanted to reintroduce elephants into unfamiliar environments, say the elephants had been wiped out of a particular region and they wanted to reintroduce them, rather than just trapping them, quote, randomly, what they realized was that they had far greater success if they moved extended families, if they moved the whole family. And then they also came to realize the importance of bulls. When they were first doing that, they were moving the cows and the female elephants and all their offspring and so forth, the whole family, but they didn't want to fool around with these big bulls that they didn't realize what role they might even be playing. Well, when they did that, some of the young bulls that were still a member of the family came into must, they came into heat. And they were trying to breed the old females who weren't interested at all. And I heard this story more than once, could take it or leave it, but they said that even trying to mount some of the white rhinos that were around the place. So it was a problem for all the creatures. Well, what they realized is that these mature bulls were playing a role in those families. When they bring the mature bull along, these young bulls behave themselves, they don't come into must. And I remember the head of that game reserve saying, after he had given us a lecture on this, he said, I think we barely scratching the surface on the interrelationships and the value of these interrelationships and the health and well-being of the animals. And that includes the old mature bulls as well. So, and let me back up and say something here. From 1991 through for probably 30 years or more, I taught short courses on all this stuff. We had people from around the world who would come to those. So there was a lady named Nan Bray who came from Tasmania. She was an oceanographer by training, and that's what she did for many years. But she decided to let that go, and she bought a place in Tasmania and runs sheep. And she really embraced all that we're talking about. These 3 legs to the stool, there's a nutritional wisdom of the body, diversity, plant diversity is key, the availability of alternatives to health, and then the social transgenerational part and the extended family. And she started then to move more and more toward extended families within the sheep, the social cultural part. And her writings about what she saw, how calm the animals became, how confident they became, the behavioral changes that led to changes in terms of production of her herd are amazing. I still put people in touch with Nan when they start to flirt with these kind of ideas, because she really went all the way in terms of that. So what I'm alluding to here is the fact that livestock live in extended families when calves, lambs, and kids aren't weaned. If you let livestock go feral, they end up in extended families, just like these animals the wild animals that I'm talking about. And that's so common in wild species. And in the book I wrote, Nourishment, I just went down and pointed out species after species after species that are extended families when it comes to ruminant herbivores. So I want to show you a short video segment here, and then we'll kind of tie this up. This is of bison in Yellowstone National Park, and we were with a friend of mine named Bob Jackson. He spent his summers for 30 years working in the most remote part of Yellowstone National Park. He was a backcountry ranger. And he became a legend for many of the things he did in the backcountry back in those days. Well, in the rest of the year, he farmed in Iowa, and what he raises bison, and he raises bison in extended families, and he's very profitable in terms of his practices. He recognizes and appreciates that all the animals are sacred. He has his own rituals for how he kills animals. He actually, when he's harvesting animals, kills entire families because he recognizes that these are families with relationships to one another. And in his way of belief and thinking, it's best to take the entire family out, and then he sells the meat of that family. But Bob got me interested in research on bison, and we went on to do a number of studies related to what I've been talking about. But this video I'm going to show you is we were with Bob Jackson in Yellowstone National Park, and we were along the Yellowstone River in the Hayden Valley, and we were watching this huge bunch of bison. We sat there for half a day, and what you're going to see is these bison coming out of this big group, and they're coming out not as one massive group, but as these families. And main families, satellite families. Once a family gets big enough, they spin off, and you have satellite families that are formed. So that's what you're going to see, and you're going to see young animals learning to become a bison, basically, in Yellowstone National Park. Every time I watch that segment, I just think of the beauty and the wonder and the mystery of natural systems. So let's conclude then. And why even think about extended families? Well, you think about the rising interest in animal welfare by consumers. Where did the meat come from? What's going on here? And several years ago, I was down in Uruguay. working with folks down there. And I was on my way back from there on the airplane, and there was one of the magazines there that's on the airplanes in the pockets, and there was an article, Buenos Aires, and I read the article, and it was amazing because this lady, Ginger Gentile, says it's the diet that makes Argentinian beef unique. Argentinian cattle are grass-fed, explains Ginger Gentile, director of a TV documentary titled Beef is Bueno. Former vegetarian, she converted to meat after moving to Buenos Aires from New York in 2002. Here's the key point relative to what we're saying. They walk around, she says, of Argentinian cattle. They live in family groups. For their short lives, they live the way cows were meant to live. I think that's a really key point, the way things are going relative to animal welfare. But beyond that, recognizing that animals aren't simply machines, that they're sentient beings that have experience, that have feelings, that are just as plants do as well, that all life in this sense, whether it's plant or animal life, is sacred, and to recognize that and to recognize our participation in that as life living on life, basically. So, but you can take that then to what's happening with places like Whole Foods, animal welfare rating 5+, animal-centered entire life on the same farm. Well, we've been talking so much about all of that, and then taking that even to this level of the notion of extended families and the value of that. And then you can see the other parts of the rating system as it goes down related to the lives of the animals. So what we've tried to do in these last two sessions, basically, let feed be thy medicine and food be thy medicine, is to talk about the three legs of the stool of nutritional wisdom, and to illustrate that, and then to talk at least briefly about some of the practical implications economically, ecologically, and socially. And I'd like to end this session on culture by saying we stress genetics as the mechanism of evolution. There's the two creatures, earthquakes are coming. Yep, the mysterious innate intuition of some animals. And certainly genetics is important. I mean, there's no denying that. But I think when that's all we focus on, we miss this much, much broader picture that I've been trying to paint. We aren't appreciating that genes are dialoguing continually with social and biophysical environments. And, you know, it's through that animals are basically learning to, as they become one of the herd within a particular social and biophysical environment. So I'll end where we started, really, with I think we made this point, I know we did, when we were talking about the only constant. We ended by saying animals aren't machines, genes aren't destiny. Animals are involved in the world, which helps them to evolve with the world, and that includes us as well. And with that, Michael, we've done the culture part.
Yeah, that was excellent. And again, I've made a bunch of notes. I don't know whether we need to go too much further with that, but you know, that last part, talking about, you know, animals are not meat machines. They have feelings and desires and goals and all the things that all creatures have in common. And it reminds me of something I heard, and I can't remember the fellow's name, but he was just sort of, the idea was, you know, let the cow be a cow, let the pig be a pig. And you know, I've been having these conversations with producers about these sort of ideas, more in the context of, you know, the producers, especially in the winter up here, they really do feel like they're prisoners to the animal.
Yes.
And we built these systems where, yeah, and so these animals aren't really adapted to take care of themselves in these conditions. And what I've been stressing is, why not build a system where the animal is fully capable of taking care of itself in that environment? And think of the freedom that allows you as a producer to have. You don't feel like you're locked in every day having to, worry about these creatures in your care, because you've built a system with the proper animal that can more or less take care of themselves. And that's going to be a system that is, lower stress, more in tune with your natural environment, less stressful, and more profitable, right? More profitable. So it's just sort of like a multiple win, multiple wins for everyone involved in that system.
No, so true, Michael, what you're saying. And I, I remember you talking about that in the past. And I think you can't overemphasize, can't say enough about that point. It makes me think too, Jim Garish wrote a book, Kick the Hay Habit. And,
Right.
just talking about those things and just going back over my career, working with people like at Deseret Land and Livestock, where they had plenty of resource to winter animals. It was just making a total change in how they looked at things and breaking out of the traditional ways of feeding and thinking, we don't need to feed. We can change the whole system and then sticking with it. So I just so second all that you're saying on that. Then you're not working for the cow anymore. You're letting the cow be a locally adapted cow, huh? And she's better off for it than you are too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's just multiple wins.